top life insurance companies to find the best policy for you. It takes just 2 minutes to get a quote. And if you don't know the first thing about insurance, they've got all the tools to get you up to speed. Learn the difference between term and whole life insurance. Calculate how much coverage you need and be sure you're making the right decision. In fact, over 4 million people have used Policy Genius to shop for insurance. How prevalent, how good is it? I can tell you, I had a listener who came up to me. He's in the life insurance industry. He said, I want you to stop reading ads for Policy Genius because they're putting us out of business. That's how good they are at this. Policy Genius doesn't just make life insurance easy. They also compare disability insurance, home insurance, auto insurance. If you care about it, they can cover it. So whether you know a lot about life insurance or nothing at all, start your search at PolicyGenius.com because you're going to plot. And when you do, you want to make sure that your family's taken care of. In just 2 minutes, you can compare quotes, make an informed decision for you and your loved ones. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy life insurance. Go check it out right now at PolicyGenius.com. Okay, so now, Jocko, let's get down to some of the main lessons of leadership. So what's the number one thing you look for in a leader?
Well, the first book was called Extreme Ownership. And what that means is you're not going to make any excuses. You're not going to blame anyone else. You're going to take ownership of whatever happens. And when something goes wrong, instead of pointing fingers and blaming someone else, you're going to take ownership of that problem. You're going to take ownership of figuring out what the solution to that problem is, and you're going to take ownership of implementing that solution. So that is the number one thing that I'm looking for a leader to do, is to take ownership of the problems. And again, we called that extreme ownership. And it was one of those things that was very easy to see in a SEAL platoon, because when someone doesn't take ownership and starts pointing fingers and blaming, well, like for instance, right now, if I started pointing my finger and blaming you for something, what's your natural reaction going to be?
You get defensive, get upset. I mean, it's not my fault this broadcast isn't what I wanted it to be.
Exactly. And then what happens is we have a team where I'm pointing the finger at you, you're pointing the finger at someone else, and now we have no one taking ownership of the problems, and therefore the problems never get solved. The opposite of that is when you have a good leader that steps up and says, hey, Ben, you know what? This broadcast didn't go the way I wanted it to. I should have done a better job preparing for your questions. I'm sorry. I apologize. And now instead of you getting defensive, you say, you know what? No, actually, I could have done a better job. And now both of us are taking ownership of the problems and we're going to get them solved. So that's kind of the number one characteristic, is someone that has the humility, because it hurts. It stings when something goes wrong and you're a leader and you say, oh, you know what? All this was a bad situation. It's my fault. I'll take ownership of it. That hurts. That stings the ego. So you have to be humble in order to do that.
How much of leadership it sounds like a lot of it is just being good person interpersonally, because it sounds like you can take that same message and apply it to marriage, where it's not really a question of you leading your spouse, but if you start blaming your spouse, the whole thing falls apart nearly immediately. Whereas if you have no expectations of your spouse and it's just you're going to take responsibility for whatever happens, then your marriage goes a lot better.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And we definitely, as soon as the first book came out, we got all kinds of feedback from people in every type of scenario, that when they started taking ownership of their relationship with their wives, with their spouses, it gets better. And obviously, this translates to personal responsibility. Because when you're walking around and you're saying, oh, it's my family and it's the market, or it's the way I was raised and these are the things that are holding me back, and all you're doing is blaming everyone else, you don't take ownership of those problems, and that's going to be problematic. The best thing to say is, okay, look, whatever happened. I'm going to take control of what I can. I'm going to go forth and conquer.
So with regard to the future of the country, I mean, obviously, my mind jumps politically, and I think that we're living in an era where there's a lot of political capital to be gained by politicians particularly in telling people that they are victims and that their first move ought to be to blame the system or blame factors outside their control. It seems like you're arguing exactly the opposite. If you actually want to have a happy life, then maybe you first ought to start taking responsibility for the decisions that are within your purview. If you were speaking to people politically, what would you be telling people along these lines?
Yeah, that's 100% right. I mean, if you're blaming everyone else, I can't control you. I can't control these other things outside. I can't control. The only thing I can control is me. So instead of worrying about who else is causing you problems, worry about what you can do to yourself to improve your station. And if you go down that path, you're going to find you have a lot more control than you think you do.
So how do you deal with situations in which it really is the person's fault, right? So you're taking responsibility for everything, but at the same time, you just have somebody who's screwed up in a serious way. I just read an editorial or an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a guy who was chewed out at one point by Steve Jobs. He's working at Apple, and Steve Jobs approaches him, obviously the quote-unquote ultimate leader in the tech sector, and he just looked at what the guy was doing and he said, this is garbage, and then he just walked away. And the guy said, well, it made me feel bad at the time, but I realized that sometimes it encouraged me to do better. Well, what do you think of that sort of leadership style? Are there times where you just have to choose somebody out, and is that ever useful?
There are very few occasions, because I'll tell you, from a leadership perspective, if you're working for me and you screw something up, whose fault is that?
I mean, presumably it's your fault for hiring me.
Well, number one, why did I hire you if you can't do the job? But even if let's say I did hire you, did I give you the right guidance? Did I give you the right support? Did I actually check back in with you and make sure that you had the resources that you needed to get the thing done? Did I make sure that you were trained properly? I mean, there's all these things that I look back at myself and say, if my subordinates aren't doing what I need them to do, that is my fault. Now, to your question, do you occasionally get someone that is either incapable of doing the job for whatever reason? They don't have the cognitive capacity, or they don't have the physical capacity, or they don't have the right attitude to get a job done. Does that happen sometimes? Yes, it absolutely does. You know, we talked about that in the new book. We had, my task unit is called Task Unit Bruiser. And we had 2 guys inside of Task Unit Bruiser that when we went through our pre-deployment training, they didn't cut it. And, you know, look, we did everything we could to mentor, to train them, to get them up to speed. But ultimately, you get to a point as a leader where you recognize this person is they're just not capable of doing the job. And I'm putting all my resources into this one individual. And I'm now starting to shun the rest of the team because I'm focused on one person. So I'm actually hurting the rest of the team. So even though I have loyalty and I take ownership of the subordinates that are working for me, at some point, my loyalty to the team will trump my loyalty to one individual. And I have to make a hard decision to get rid of that person.
It's kind of a bizarre question, but my mind is going toward family situations. What do you do with kids? Like, let's say that you have several kids.
I have 4.
So you have 4 kids. And let's say that one of them is a slacker, and it's not a situation where you can just sort of cut them and fire them. The kid's stuck with, you got to do what you got to do. How do you determine where to put your resources, given that one kid very often it requires more attention than another kid in this sort of area?
The thing with raising kids is, and again, I used to shy away from talking about this because I used to say, you know what, my kids, the results aren't in yet, right? And I don't know where they're going to end up.
Yeah.
And also, it's like, you know, is your kid successful? Well, what does that actually mean? Because my kid could go and make a ton of money, but have a horrible family life and be miserable, right? And be a jerk, right? Is that success? No. Or they could be very happy but have no money and be living day to day, and so that's not successful either. But my kids are a little bit older now, and I can see this trajectory that they are on, and quite frankly, I'm pretty happy with the way my kids have turned out. It's a hard thing to look at because you can't fully control it. And so what are you going to do with your kids? You know, you got to give them guidance, right? But you also have to let them brush up against the guardrails of failure. You know, a simple example that I would say, and I probably have taken some flack for this, is I say, if you're helping your kids, you're hurting your kids. And what I mean by that, something as simple as tying your shoe, right? If you help your kid when they're whatever age, 2 years old, 3 years old, if you help them tie their shoe, you're actually taking away an opportunity for them to develop their fine motor skills. That's really happening at that moment. So if you do that, if you cook them every meal, if you don't let them, get their cereal bowl out, and guess what? They're going to spill milk sometimes, and they're going to knock over the cereal. And at the same time, they're developing skills that are going to help them fend for themselves in the world. So what you have to do is you have to let them brush up against the guardrails of failure from time to time. Now, where it becomes challenging as a parent, and thank God I haven't faced anything like this, sometimes your kids will take turns that will ruin their life, right? That will ruin their life. And, obviously, I'm not going to let one of my kids ruin their lives. That being said, if people take a really hard turn and do things that are completely against the parameters that you believe in, and you continue to support them, they're going to continue to take advantage of you. And so I've seen that happen with parents where kids go down the wrong direction. Like I said, I can't even imagine the catch-22 that you get in that situation where, if your kid becomes a drug addict and you want nothing more than to help them, but every time you give them the support that you think is going to help them, you're actually just enabling them. And so again, I'm no expert. What I try and do is put a box around the kids, let them develop, let them grow, and put the guardrails out there. Let them know when they disappoint you. But the other part of this is, and this is another hard thing for people to understand, it was definitely hard for me to understand, your kids aren't going to be who you want them to be. They're going to be who they are. And in my opinion, the more you force them to try and be what it is you want them to be, the harder the pushback is going to be, and you can end up with some really horrible situations.
Okay, so we talked about taking extreme responsibility. What are some of the other attributes of leaders that you look for?
Well, humility is obviously the big one. You got to be humble. If you're not humble, then that's going to be problematic. Now, what's interesting, new book that just came out is Dichotomy of Leadership. And what does that mean? That means that as a leader, you have to be balanced, right? You have to be balanced. So let's just take humility and ego, because we're looking for people that are humble. But at the same time, you can have someone that's so humble that they lack confidence. That's bad. On the other side of that spectrum, you can have someone that's so confident that they're overconfident, their ego's big, and they don't listen to anyone else. Where do you want to be? You want to be balanced, somewhere in the middle. I talked about the fact that you need to be articulate as a leader. That's great. Can you be a leader that talks so much that people stop listening to you? The other end of the spectrum is you are a leader that doesn't say enough, and now the team doesn't know what direction they're supposed to be going in. So where do you want to be? You want to be somewhere in the middle. You want to be balanced. And so what we've seen working with, after that book, Extreme Ownership, came out, we saw leaders, the biggest problem that leaders have, because the last chapter in Extreme Ownership is called The Dichotomy of Leadership. It's talking about these points. But we didn't go deep enough. It was only one chapter. And as we continue to work with leaders, hundreds of leaders, you realize the problem that they suffer the most is they go too far in one direction or the other. So the best characteristic to have as a leader is to be balanced.
There's a certain amount of that authenticity, because how much can you train into being a leader and move yourself out of where you authentically are? So you tend to be a quiet person, and now you're trying to train yourself into being the guy who can give a rah motivational speech on the floor. Are you better off just perfecting the skills that you already have, or are you better off working on the skills that you lack?
You know, it's interesting you talk about this, the fact of just being loud, right? You said a quiet person. Being loud is a characteristic of a good leader. It absolutely is, and especially of being a combat leader. Because if you're in a combat situation and you need guys to move to that door over there and there's a machine gun fight going on, the only way you're going to do it is if you're loud enough to make that happen. You're loud enough to yell and let everyone know that. I had a guy coming through my training, really smart guy, Ivy League guy, very cerebral, quiet as a mouse. And I said to him, I said, listen, you're going to need to get loud. Like, your guys cannot hear you. You're going to need to learn to project your voice. He was, for all practical purposes, as far as I could tell, physically incapable of projecting his voice. And so as I was watching him go through these iterations, I kept saying to him, you've got to be louder. You've got to be louder. Your guys can't hear you. And I didn't think he was going to make it. And then one iteration that they're going through, I see him, he needs to get guys over to this door over here. And he grabs Billy, who is the biggest loudmouth in the platoon. And he goes, Billy, get everyone to that door over there. And Billy goes, Bill, everyone get to that door. And everyone moved. And I realized that he was smarter than me. What he figured out was he could complement an area of weakness that he had with his team. And so, yes, there's ways that you can increase your capabilities. And like I said, you can become more articulate. You can learn to simplify more. You can become more persuasive if you continue to try and talk to people. But maybe something like being loud, this guy just couldn't do it. But he was able to take his team and pull the strengths in his team together to become a better leader himself. And that's always something that a good leader will do. We hear it all the time. Surround yourself with good people. I would add to that, surround yourself with good people that complement the areas that you're weak.
So how do you get a leader who's, let's say, an 80% leader to a 95% leader? Is this somebody who is just lacking motivation, or is it somebody who requires a skill set? Like, what you have a guy and you think he's good raw material. Are there actual exercises in which you can engage to become a better leader? Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the SEAL teams, what we would do is we would run guys through these really complicated training scenarios that I'm talking about. In the business world, we do role-playing with people. And I'll put you in a situation as a leader where I say, okay, I'm your worst nightmare employee. Or not even your worst nightmare. Hey, I'm that older guy that's been doing this for 25 years, and I don't want to change the way I'm doing anything. And you got to get me to change it. Let's go. Let's figure this out. And what you see is 2, 3, 4 iterations of having these hard conversations. People get better at them. That's one aspect of leadership that you can definitely get better at. We run through planning drills so people learn to simplify. We run through communication drills so people learn to simplify their message. There's all kinds of ways to go from that 80% leader to the 95, 100% leader. When it comes to, you've been in situations, obviously in warfare situations, how much of the textbook stuff is applicable? I mean, is it just you have to live through it and then a certain natural leadership capacity takes over? Or is it that you can game out all this stuff? I mean, is it possible to really game out crisis scenarios, or is it basically you do the best that you can and then you're just doing what you do? Here's the answer to that. Combat, and this is very
counterintuitive to what people might think. Combat is an absolute exercise in creativity.